Hello and welcome. This is Expulsion at 50, a podcast series created to commemorate the 50-year anniversary of the expulsion of Asians from Uganda. My name is Dollar Sani. In June 2021, I interviewed Maya Parmar, the author of the book Reading Cultural Representations of the Double Diaspora, Britain, East Africa, Gujarat, published in 2019. Maya highlights the work she did for the 40th anniversary and shares her thoughts on this podcast series. I hope you enjoy listening to our conversation.
One thing that I worry about, and I'm sure lots of people, including yourself, worry about, is that these stories are so close to being lost now. As I get older, as the generation above me get older, these stories will disappear and memories will begin to erode. And that's why something like your podcast is so important, and it's so timely as well. And it's wonderful thing that you've grasped upon the 50th anniversary to kind of capture some of these stories and some of these memories, because they will disappear. And up until now, we haven't done the work we need to in kind of recording them. So I have a research interest in South Asian diasporic cultural expressions of identity, forms of belonging, and for a long time it's been particularly focused on what I describe as the double diaspora. So now I work at the Open University as a postdoctoral researcher. I have an honorary research fellowship at the University of Exeter. My research is within English literature, so you might see me kind of waving a range of books at you whilst we're talking and referring to lots of literature, because that's kind of my specialism. And dancing behind movie scenes, behind those movie screens. Asher Bartley, she's the one that keeps the dream alive from the morning past the evening to the end of the light. So my mum and dad are both from Kenya. So they both have a heritage stemming back to Gujarat. I was born here, and I think I would describe here as home now. And actually, interestingly, I conducted some oral histories with my parents in the run-up to going to Kenya, and I think they would both describe Britain as home now too.
Had you always been interested and curious about your history?
I became alive to that history very late on, really. I think it was only when I went to, so at university I studied English literature. In my final year I did a course in postcolonial literature, which suddenly I felt like my eyes were opened. I suddenly thought, my God, this is where I am. I can finally see something of me and who I am in this world of university academia, of this world of English literature and the humanities. And it sparked my imagination. So I went on to do a master's in postcolonial and cultural studies within the English department at the University of Leeds. And it was again there that I was able to hone this interest and begin to realise that very few people in the contemporary period were thinking about or interested in this story of the South Asian community who had been in East Africa and then who had come to Britain. And when I looked at who was looking at it within literature, that suddenly became like nil. Nobody had done anything, and nobody was interested in that. I mean, there had been work in sociology or in history, particularly when the South Asian community were in East Africa. So there has been writing about the expulsion itself, and there may be some following up on that within the disciplines of like history or sociology. But back then it was very sparse.
So Maya, why do you think that was, and what shows up when you ask that question?
Yeah, well, so that's what my PhD research was really, it was kind of one of the questions it was looking at. It's like, well, especially when you thought about, and, you know, I keep talking about back then because this research I was doing this around 10 years ago, especially when you looked at back then when there was a huge interest in South Asian in the South Asian diaspora. So you had you'd have your like Brick Lane, or if we think about popular culture, you had East is East, or you had Bend It Like Beckham. You had all of those stories, right? But actually, where was the story about people like us? We are such a large population, really, when you think about it. There are so many of us in Britain. I mean, whenever you talk to a South Asian, often you'll find out that they have some sort of twice migrant background. So yeah, it's an absolutely pertinent question. Why? Why does there exist that gap? I think it was for a couple of reasons. I mean, they've actually been relatively, on the whole, quite successful when they've come to Britain. And so they're often held up as an example of like the migrant who's done really well. And because of the success, I suppose they're kind of marginalised within that story. We're not talked about because there's no need to really talk about us other than say, oh, look, these are the South Asians that have done really well. I think the other thing is that the twice migration often also means that they're hidden amongst the wider South Asian diaspora. So because they haven't come directly from India and there's that kind of twice movement, suddenly they become hidden and they become lost within the wider South Asian diaspora. There has for a long time been maybe an uninterest, maybe a lack of interest in investing in the arts. And that lack of investment in the arts has meant that we've been hidden in some ways. Why there's a lack of investment? Well, that's a whole other question, isn't it? We don't care about no government warning about that promotion of the simple life of the dams they're building.
I wonder if it's something about the fact that the majority of East African Asians were business people coming from a mercantile community.
Like you say, it's a mercantile community of Gujaratis, right? Even though they've been successful, their narrative does involve multiple forms of upheaval, and the expulsion, was abrupt and particularly traumatic. And so perhaps what has been at the forefront of the community's mind is creating home and belonging and security and stability, and maybe the arts haven't factored into that.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the in 2014, was it 2014? 2012 would have been the
2012.
20 year was the 40-year anniversary. So how did that kind of come into your lap?
Back then there wasn't really a lot of work being done on it, and when I became aware of what was going on in 2010 and that this anniversary was coming up, there weren't many people working on it. So I really felt that it was an important opportunity to commemorate the expulsion, but not only that, to draw attention to the wider experiences of deracination that happened to the populations in Kenya and Tanzania, because whilst the Ugandan expulsion was particularly abrupt and traumatic, it tends to garner much more interest than the other forms of deracination in the region that happened during the same period. And I think that's probably expected, and it's probably it's probably natural. But I saw the anniversary as a way to kind of commemorate the expulsion, but also the wider experiences that South Asians had in Kenya and Tanzania, kind of drawing our attention to this idea of the double diaspora, so the people that have been moved or have moved twice, because we often think of South Asians, when we think about them in Britain, we think about them coming from India and then coming to Britain. And it's a very simple, like one place to another, like homeland to host country movement, whereas actually it's not. And the double diasporas experience highlights that the way people move is much more complicated and much more complex. And of course, that reflects in their experiences, the way that they, the way memory works, the way belonging works. So that's one other thing I wanted to do whilst commemorating the 40th anniversary. And the final thing was, when we think about South Asians that have moved to East Africa and then come to Britain, we tend to think of Leicester. Everyone kind of thinks of Leicester because of the way in which they've the way in which they've regenerated parts of the city, for example, the Golden Mile, and the way that they're quite populous there. But of course, this community exists elsewhere. They exist all over Britain, and they've been doing it. I mean, there are plenty of this community in Scotland, and they're doing similar things elsewhere. So in Leeds, where I was then, and where I held the commemoration event. And so I wanted to say, hey, look, everyone, we've got a community in Leeds as well, and there are lots of them around the country. And let's look at this anniversary, let's remember it and see what happens. But let's think of the other forms of less popular identity and belonging that exist within this community.
So what did Expulsion 40 Years On entail?
Ultimately, what Expulsion 40 Years On involved was kind of a community day in the city centre, in the museum, where people came, and we had kind of storytelling, we had food, Gujarati East African food available. We had Yasmin Ali Brown come and perform her play Nowhere to Belong. And then running alongside that, we had I had an educational element where we went into primary schools and we tried to run workshops on food, music and dance to kind of think about themes of migration and the expulsion and those sorts of things. And then the article that you waved at me at the beginning of this talk came from that. Basically, it was another way of kind of commemorating the 40th anniversary, but also the events that I delivered, producing something in written form, something that had kind of longevity.
As you know, this podcast series has been created to commemorate the 50-year anniversary, which happens next year in 2022. So for you, Maya, what have been some of the main takeaways as a listener?
And that's one of the things I've enjoyed so much about the podcasts that I've been able to listen to in your series. It's that intricacy of detail that they offer, those kind of like those everyday experiences that you don't really hear about in other forms, in the history text. The kind of I think the one day you're like, oh well, Dad's saying it doesn't apply to us, we're citizens, it's okay. And then a couple of days later, the realization, you can hear it in the voices of your participants when they're remembering it, the realization that actually this horrible statement that Armin's put out, it is actually going to apply to us. And actually, like, how many days is left? And you don't get that in other forms, but in your podcast you can really hear it, and I really like that within what you're offering. It's very interesting and also very saddening often to hear people recall those memories. One of the other things that I really like is the variety it offers. It really adds shades of kind of grey to an experience that might otherwise look very black and white if you look at it in the history books. I mean, not only do you have the details there that I just described, I caught a bit of Vanitha Ben's story, and it was lovely to hear the Gujarati and the expressions in Gujarati as well. So I think that's one of the other huge strengths that the podcasts have, because it allows a range of voices to be heard that would otherwise be lost.
So moving forward, do you have any suggestions and any closing remarks?
Have you thought about how the material that you're producing is going to be archived in the long term? Because YouTube and Spotify are good contemporary platforms, but they are a little bit unstable. So in some ways, we don't know what would happen to the material in 10, 15 years' time. Whereas places that hold more formalised archives, like the British Library or maybe the National Archives, if they are interested in taking on your material as a body, they can make some sort of commitment to the way that they're going to host it and look after it. So that's the one thing I might be thinking about if I was you, kind of the longevity and how the material that's very precious that you're producing is going to be looked after in the very long term. But I also think we've come a long way in 10 years since I was working. And so, yeah, I definitely think that we're moving in the right direction to ensure these memories aren't forgotten.
Feel free to share this podcast with your friends and family. You're also most welcome to post any comments. Thank you for listening. Until next time, keep well and stay safe.